Batman, Spider-Man, Superman. These iconic characters, along with many others, are worth billions. But what if I told you the people that created these billion-dollar characters went completely broke and even died penniless? Some being forced to become a delivery man just to survive, to others who ended up freezing to death on a park bench, homeless and alone. These creators gave us some of the most iconic characters of all time, but due to corporate greed, theft, and just unfortunate circumstances, they ended up all going broke. So let's unmask the heartbreaking stories of these comic legends that went broke, with each story becoming more and more tragic than the last. Gary Friedrich, he worked at Marvel as a writer, more on their war stuff, and he also co-created Ghost Rider in Marvel Spotlight number 5. By the age of 35, he was struggling a lot with alcoholism and left comics altogether. Yes, I know, at such a young age. He couldn't really find any work, so he became like a driver/courier. In 2007, he found out that Marvel was making a Ghost Rider movie, so then he sued Marvel, claiming that he owned the rights to Ghost Rider. It went on for 4 years, and in the end, he ended up losing because he was just a work for hire, and they didn't consider him actually owning the rights to Ghost Rider. But then Marvel countersued him for $17,000 because during the lawsuit, he was creating his own Ghost Rider merchandise and selling it, which is illegal because he didn't own the copyrights to it. So then in the end, Marvel said the only thing you can do is you can sign your name on already pre-made Marvel merchandise that features Ghost Rider. Due to all those legal fees, he ended up dying completely broke in 2018. Herb Trimpe, he worked as a writer and artist for Marvel, mostly on the Hulk, G.I. Joe, and Transformers, and he's also known for co-creating Wolverine. After serving in the military, in 1967, he joined Marvel and worked on staff there until they went bankrupt in 1996 when they let him go. He was struggling to find work because comic books were just in the toilets at that time. And so he decided to go back to college to get his master's degree. He was completely broke at this point, so he took a job as an art teacher at a local college. Later, he was able to find some freelance work back in comics again until his death in 2015. Chris Ivey, he's an artist. He's worked for Marvel, DC, Dynamite. He's worked on the Hulk, Flash, Green Lantern, a ton of different characters. He started with Marvel in 1988, but then in 1996, when Marvel filed bankruptcy, he found himself not able to find any work. He struggled for a very long time. He had mountains and mountains of debt. He ended up living in his car, homeless, and then one day he was on the internet and he saw an ad for the Hero Initiative, which is kind of like a charity where basically more well-known artists will draw something and they sell it in an auction. All that money goes to help struggling artists. So he didn't think much of it. He's like, well, maybe they'll give me like maybe a few $1,000s. They ended up helping out a lot. They paid off all his debts. They got him an apartment and they also secured him some work. But it seems more recently he's had GoFundMe saying that he's behind on rent again and he really can't make it by. So he's back to being broke again. Steve Gerber, he was a writer for Marvel and he's most famous for creating Howard the Duck. He started working at Marvel in 1972, working on a range of characters and titles. Eventually he created Howard the Duck in Adventure into Fear number 19. Howard the Duck became kind of a cult classic. He even got his own series, and eventually he got his own newspaper strip. But due to Gerber being so late with getting his work in on time, the newspaper basically went to Marvel and said, unless you drop your writer, we're going to drop the newspaper strip. Marvel pretty much fired him from Howard the Duck series and from the newspaper strip. And then a few years later, he found out that they were making a movie, and so he naturally sued Marvel over the copyright, saying that he owned Howard the Duck. To help pay for some of the legal fees, Jack Kirby actually through Eclipse Comics created Destroyer Duck, where all the proceeds went to help Gerber sue Marvel. But in the end, he lost and Marvel won. He ended up amassing $140,000 in legal fees, and he no longer worked at Marvel, so he would take various works to various publishers, but it started getting less and less over time. Towards the end of his life, he relied a lot on the Hero Initiative to help pay for his medical bills, and he ended up dying broke in 2008. Wally Wood, he's an artist most known for a lot of Golden Age EC books like Weird Science and Fantasy, and also known for creating Daredevil's red costume. He found a lot of success in the Golden Age and Silver Age years as an artist, but as time went on, he decided he was going to open his own publishing company. He created Wit's End, which was a massive financial failure. He got divorced 2 times, and due to his lifelong struggle with alcohol, he had kidney failure and also lost the vision in one of his eyes. Since he couldn't really find any work anymore, he went completely broke and shot and killed himself in 1981. Before his death, he said something kind of interesting. He said, if I had to do it all over again, I would cut off my hands. So I guess he thought, since he became an artist, his life was just a massive struggle. Bill Mantlo worked at Marvel as a writer. He created characters such as Rocket Raccoon, Cloak and Dagger, Rom, many other characters. So he worked at Marvel through the 1970s and 1980s, but then in 1992, while rollerblading, a car came and hit him and then fled the scene and left him with extreme brain damage, where now he needs round-the-clock care. He's no longer able to work and racked up millions of dollars in medical expenses. He's still alive though, living in an assisted living facility, and usually relies on the comic book community to do fundraisers to help him get by. Fletcher Hanks. Now he was an artist who worked in the golden age. He worked on like Stardust the Wizard and also Phantom, which was one of the first female superheroes ever, predating Wonder Woman. Now he only worked at comics for a couple of years because he was such an alcoholic, he couldn't hold a job. Now most of the time he would just paint murals for like rich people, but then he would take all that money and then go out drinking, gambling, spending it on his friends, and leaving his wife and 4 children at home to fend for themselves. Yes, the son, the oldest son, actually had to go to work to support the family. And then one day, their father comes home, drunk or whatever, steals all of their son's money that he collected to help the family, and this left and never came back. The mother said, it's a small price to pay for that bum to be gone. Many years later, they found him dead, frozen to death on a New York City park bench. He was completely broke, homeless, and alone. Malcolm Nicholson. Now this one is very fascinating. He created DC Comics. He was born in 1890, and he joined the military out of high school. And at the age of 27, he became the youngest person to ever make major in the U.S. Army. After World War I, he became a pulp magazine writer. And then one day he saw Famous Funnies magazine, which is considered the first comic book. But the thing about Famous Funnies is in the beginning, they just reprinted comic book strips that were in the newspaper. And so he thought, well, I could do that. So he created National Publication, which later became DC Comics, and created his first comic book. But he wanted to get very popular newspaper strips to reprint in his comic book, but all the good ones were taken. So he decided, hey, I'll just create my own original stories. In 1935, he premiered New Comics #1, which became the first comic book ever to contain all original material. And by issue #6, he brought on writer and artist team Siegel and Shuster, who a few years later created Superman. But despite coming up with the first comic book, he struggled financially because a lot of newsstands didn't want to carry his comic book because it was untested. Because they would rather have something that's been proven before. Here's all original material, and they're like, no one knows these characters. I don't want to take the risk of buying all these and not being able to sell them. His company struggled so much that he had to move into a friend's apartment rent-free with his family. His wife would call sometimes crying on the phone because they didn't have enough money for the milkman to feed their kids. And then one day he goes to his office and finds that he can't get in because it's all locked up, because the person he was renting his office from said he was so far behind on payments that he basically kicked him out. So in the end, he was forced to sell DC Comics to pay off all of his debts. One of the last comic books he worked on was Detective Comics #1, which later in issue #27 featured Batman. Speaking of Batman, Bill Finger. He co-created Batman, the Joker, Robin, Riddler, most of all of Batman's villains, and even Green Lantern. Now most people think that Bob Kane created Batman. Well, actually what happened was Bob Kane had the idea of a Batman character, came to his writing partner, Bill Finger, and they together created Batman. His backstory, the way he looked, his mask, his cape, everything. Bill Finger then wrote the scripts for Detective 27 and 28, and then Bob Kane did the artwork. They then went to DC and they put it in Detective 27, and Batman pretty much became an instant hit. Well, what Bob Kane did, he then went to DC Comics, and then he was like, you know what? I'm going to license out this Batman character and not give you the rights to Batman. But in exchange, not only will you give me money, but I want it to say that Bob Kane only created Batman and no Bill Finger. So he got no rights of it. Also, any comic book with Batman, even if Bob Kane didn't draw it, would say drawn by Bob Kane. So for many years, Shelley Moldoff was the artist for Batman, but it would always say Bob Kane. Since he completely pushed Bill Finger out from owning any share of Batman, he got none of the royalties. Bill Finger ended up dying completely alone at the age of 59 in his apartment. And in fact, they didn't even know he was dead for 3 days. It wasn't until after Bill Finger's death that Bob Kane acknowledged that Bill Finger had a big hand in creating Batman. Siegel and Shuster, they created Superman. So Siegel and Shuster had been developing a Superman story since they were 19. Originally, they wanted to sell Superman as a comic strip in the newspaper. But eventually, they couldn't get anyone to buy it except DC Comics, who said they'll put it in Action Comics #1. But before it debuted in Action Comics #1, they sold DC Comics the rights to Superman for $130, which would be equivalent to about $3,000 today. Superman became an instant hit, and they got none of the rewards for that because they sold the rights to DC. But DC kept them on as the writer and artist because they sold so well. At their peak, they were making $600,000 a year each working on Superman comic books. But then DC decided to make a Superboy comic book, which they actually pitched that idea to DC a few years prior. And since they pitched it, they said, we own the rights. So they then sued DC, not only for the rights of Superboy, but then also tried to get some merchandising rights and all sorts of stuff for Superman. Now the court said that, well, you signed over your rights, you own none of the rights of Superman, but they did own kind of the rights of Superboy. They settled and they agreed to relinquish all the rights to Superman and Superboy for $94,000, which is worth about $1.2 million today. But after all the court fees, they were only left with about $29,000. And then after the lawsuit, DC pretty much fired them. In total, working at DC from 1937 to 1947, they made a total combined of $400,000, which is $7.7 million today. Afterwards, the duo decided to part ways, and Siegel couldn't really find any steady work again. By 1959, he was struggling to pay his bills and living in a one-bedroom apartment. Shuster started losing his eyesight, so he couldn't really find any work anymore as an artist. So he got a job as a delivery man delivering packages just to make a living. One day when he's delivering packages, he had to deliver one to DC Comics. And when the CEO found out that Shuster was delivering the package, he gave him $100 and said, go get a new coat and a new job. One day they found out that DC was making a Superman movie. So then they tried to sue them again. DC, not wanting the negative press, decided to settle it and say, how about we just give you $20,000 a year for the rest of your life, which they agreed to. Shuster ended up dying completely broke and alone and in mountains of debt. DC ended up paying off all of his debts because they didn't want his heirs to come after him legally. I still can't believe it. All these massive billion-dollar characters and the creators literally got nothing. And they all went like broke. Recently in comic books, they've changed things a bit. So if a writer and artist creates a book for Marvel or DC, they're no longer a work for hire, but they do own the rights to that character. So hopefully in the future, you won't find any more these breakout characters that have billion-dollar franchises and the creators end up going broke. Let me know if there's any other creators that you know of that went completely broke. Have a good day.